This week I'm finishing up another pot you may have seen me throw and trim a few months ago now. The initial idea was to create a new style of base piece for the totems of pots I've been making, or simply a small pedestal for something like a teapot. It won't be a pot of vital importance, but one used to help display others. I also plan on making it from one single piece of clay, which is rather mad, to be honest. I'll be throwing the entire stem section solid, and then once carefully dried out to leather hard, I'll trim this section out. The quicker way, perhaps, is by throwing two separate parts and then joining them together, but by throwing it as one, I sort of simplify the process, provided you can trim that deep. It'll also mean that the piece moves and warps less after the parts have been joined together, and it's less likely for a crack to form around the join itself. Basically, I'd only recommend doing it the way I'm about to, if you are very comfortable at trimming. If not, throwing the two parts, trimming them, scoring and slipping them together, and then just refining that shape is probably the better option. Now for this piece I'm going to be using relatively hard clay, as if I were to use really soft clay, the thicker stem section would take a much longer time to dry out, but as this clay is initially really quite hard, it should stiffen a bit faster. The process you see me doing now is called spiral wedging. It's a way of mixing the clay to remove air pockets and to fully blend the clay body itself, so it's one smooth, even texture throughout, and it's actually something I've made a much longer video about, if you'd like to watch that and learn more. I'll leave a link to that on screen now and in the description below. You can feel the change beneath your hands as you're wedging, especially if you're starting out with something that is a bit rough and full of pockets of air. As the spiral you're twisting this clay into gets smaller and smaller, the pockets of air are stretched and popped, which is important, as if you encounter a particularly big pocket of air as you're throwing the piece, it creates a cavity in the wall of the pot, essentially creating an uneven patch, which you then either have to throw around, patch up, or ignore, and however you decide to deal with it, it either adds time to the process or creates an irregularity in the work. I work the lump of clay into a conical shape like this with a rounded bottom. This way, when the piece of clay is chucked against the wheelhead, it can't trap any air beneath it. I use the concentric rings on the wheelhead to help me guide the piece into centre, which means even after I've slammed it down slightly off centre, I can nudge it and pat it into the middle. Again, it doesn't need to be perfectly centred, but if at this point it's swaying back and forth and is wobbling all over the place, you'll have a much more difficult time centering it thereafter. Which is exactly what I'm doing now, although sped up rather a lot. I think for the particular shape I'm making, I want to begin with a tapering form like this. And in a few ways, making this will be just like throwing off the hump, as I'm only going to be opening up and throwing the very top portion of this. As for the bottom 2/3, I just need to make sure it's centered really well and has the approximate shape I want. But with all that said, as there's going to be so much clay in this, if there is any movement in this piece after it's been thrown, I'll be able to easily trim it back into the exact shape I want. I use the tips of my thumbs to create a small divot in the top, with a touch of water inside the hole just to hydrate the clay and stop it sticking to my fingers. You want the clay to be able to flow freely wherever your hands take it, but if the clay does ever dry out, it simply sticks to your hands, either drawing the piece off centre, or, if it happens suddenly, the entire piece can be torn off, so it's imperative that the surface is kept wet and partly covered in slip, whilst the pot is shaped, at least. I then pinch the walls and gradually pull them up, and for this piece I want to create a shallow shape, a moderately wide bowl with walls that overhang and have an angular shape to them, so that this vessel sits within my family of work. I can also collar up the stem from underneath to give this piece a bit of extra height, but doing this will normally alter the shape of the bowl itself, so there's always some back and forth when creating pieces like this. One part is affected, so another part needs to be fixed, but fundamentally this is a really simple shape to throw. It'll be the trimming that provides a real challenge, and the glazing and firing thereafter that could instigate some problems. I can potentially see the lower section warping in the firing, so that the opening of the base is oval as compared to circular, or the glaze from the foot could flow onto the kiln shelf, sticking the pot in place and potentially damaging it. With the shape of the pedestal roughly there, I start scraping away some of the excess clay from around the stem, and then I start straightening it using the sharp, flat edge of a plastic or metal kidney. They both more or less do the same job. I tend to lean towards metal. It's much sharper and bites the clay, and there's a greater chance that it'll catch. But the trade-off is that it leaves lovely, smooth surfaces, and is much better at taking away slip. The so-called kiss of steel, as one of my tutors used to say. It's at this point that I impart the subtle, angular shape into the exterior of the bowl, and I'll make this part quite thin so it shouldn't need much turning. I hope the weight of all that clay in the stem isn't too much for the bowl when it comes to turning this piece upside down and trimming the foot, but there's only one way to find out. The next thing I'm going to do is dry out this lower half a bit. and I can use a turning tool even at this stage just to scrape away the outer layer of clay and to refine the shape. And to get this piece off the wheel, I'll blast it again with the heat gun, drying out the surface enough so that I can easily clasp my hands around it and lift it away from the wheel by the stem without leaving any indentations in it. The rim is then compressed and chamoised smooth. This is really just a light touch to even out the rim. And with that, a taut, twisted metal wire is slid underneath the stemmed vessel, separating it from the metal wheel head. This is sort of how I envisage using it later, although in retrospect, when editing this and doing the narration and really looking at things, I should have made it larger, as this of course will shrink about 12%, and whilst that might not sound like a lot, when it's an object shrinking down proportionally, it really does end up being quite a lot. For a comparison in size, here it is next to a chalice I made recently. It's definitely larger, but I still can't wait to see how it looks once fired, clad in glass, and used as a pedestal of sorts for a teapot like this. What I'm making is, ultimately, a rather useless vessel, at least the way I intend to use it, as it's decorative more than anything. Now, to dry out that stem portion properly, I'm going to flip the vessel upside down and leave this part mostly exposed overnight, as obviously there's just so much more damp material in this section, meaning it's going to take much longer to dry out as compared to the bowl section on top. Ideally, I want both parts to be the same consistency before I trim them, so I'll wrap up the bowl section overnight, wrap it in plastic, and then pin that down with some props so that it doesn't creep up overnight and cover more of the stem than I'd like. It's the following morning, and whilst it still feels slightly cold, which is a good indicator that it's still quite soft inside, the outside feels really quite dry. So I'm going to get to work and begin trimming this, and if I encounter any softness, I'll give the pot a quick blast with the heat gun. I know that most of the softness I'll encounter will be within that stem, so for now I'm just going to begin by levelling the piece so that it spins perfectly flat, which I do by flipping it the right way up and checking the rim to see if it spins evenly. In this instance there was a very subtle up and down undulation in it, so I flip it back upside down, tap centre it, and then I use a turning tool just to trim the bottom flat. This should resolve any undulation in the rim. This smoother, flatter surface will also stick much better to the wheel head after a band of slip has been brushed beneath it. I make sure to keep this on the outer portion of the stem, as if the entirety of the bottom is covered in slip, then the plinth will be really stuck down, and getting it off hereafter will be really difficult. Much better. Now it's spinning practically perfectly level. The last thing I do to make sure it's securely attached to the wheel head is use a plastic kidney just to press in the lowest portion of the wall into the metal, and from this point I'll begin by trimming the bowl on the top. This is the easy part, as the trimmings that are removed simply fall off the vessel onto the wheel and into the wheel tray, whereas when it comes to hollowing out the stem, all of the turnings are simply going to fall back into the area I'm working on, which still happens when you're trimming the inside of a pot, like this, but in this case they're much more straightforward to remove, as I can easily reach my hand inside to scoop them out. Whereas again, on the plinth that's holding this bowl up, I won't really be able to reach my hand easily inside to fish them out. The best thing about trimming a bowl like this at this point is that I can trim and refine the interior shape as much as I want, as there's absolutely no way I'll be able to ever trim a hole in the bottom of this. But when flipped upside down, and when it comes to hollowing out the stem, I think that's actually going to be really tricky, as I think it's going to be practically impossible to feel the cross section between the bowl and the stem, and it's paramount that I don't leave it too thick, as that's when things like S-cracks occur. This means that potentially there could be a lot of taking the pot off the wheel to check the thickness, as the only way to really do that is to press lightly on the bottom of the bowl from this way up to see if the floor of the bowl moves at all. If I can press here and it feels really solid and it barely budges, then it's probably a bit too thick. But if I can feel a very slight amount of movement, then there's a good chance that it's thin enough. Ultimately, if you want to avoid things like S-cracks in your pots, your best bet is to make the cross-section of the pot all over as even in thickness as it can be. If you have, say, a plate which is really thick in the base but then has a thin flange around the rim, then that's a vessel that will likely crack as it dries, as there's a discrepancy in the cross-section's thickness. The last thing I do on this top section is burnish the rim with a plastic kidney to make it lovely and glassy and smooth, as a rim that's left gritty will really affect the glaze that eventually coats it, leaving it feeling rough and speckled as compared to even and smooth. As the piece is relatively tall, I can trim the underside of the bowl too at this point, which I do with a sharp, straight tungsten carbide blade, a tool that I can almost use like a guide in itself, as its straightness dictates the shape left on the clay. I'll also be trimming the outside portion of the stem at this stage, as I think proportionally I'll have a better understanding of the shape when it's this way up. The form is then flipped upside down, providing me access to the underside of the foot, and once tap-centered, I secure it in place with 3 lumps of clay around the rim. And I should mention, I'm centering the stem at this stage, not so much the bowl underneath it. I press these lugs of clay directly down against the metal, letting the material that splays inward be the clay that holds the pot in place. This is opposed to pressing the material inward, which I sometimes see people do, and it's a mistake as it can distort the rim itself by either pressing small portions of it inward and distorting the shape, or even cracking the rim if it's pressed too hard. And now begins the long process of hollowing out the stem. I begin by trimming it flat, especially around the outside, as making it perfectly level after everything's been hollowed out is still doable, but the chance that you accidentally trim down too much and take a large chunk out of the foot is far greater, so it's best to do it now. For most of this process, I'm going to be using the sharp corner of this steel turning tool, as the metal blade isn't beveled, which means I can use it practically horizontally to slice away clay, whereas the blades on my tungsten carbide tools simply wouldn't be usable at this angle due to the blade's angle itself. The key when trimming out something like this is to do it layer by layer. Things go wrong when you try and remove too much in any one go, or trim too close to the edge, as if the blade does catch, it can remove more clay than you'd like, and the process of adding it back isn't always as simple as you'd think. So I tend to remove clay more quickly from the inner portion first, and then I work more carefully as I approach the outer portion of the foot, taking my time, really holding the tool steadily, and trying my hardest to never let the blade catch, as that's when things go wrong. And to help keep the blade sturdy, I hold it in a fist grip, clasping it practically as tightly as I can, removing the stoneware layer by layer from the inside out and tidying up the outer wall as I go. This, I would say, is a rather advanced technique, because as I go, my grip on the tool gets further and further back, which means I have less control the deeper I go, in theory. Like you can see here, I'm practically holding the tool from the end, whereas normally when I trim, I work with my fingers clasped around the blade section, as that's when I've got the most control. At the same time, the deeper I've got, the softer the material has become. This means the blade does cleave away clay more easily, but this also means that if I were to make a mistake, the effects would be much more widely felt. At this stage, I'm approaching the right depth, and the sides of the walls are relatively neat, but I'll do a touch more work to refine them and to smooth them, as ideally I want these interior walls to have the same finish as those on the outside. Otherwise, the glaze that eventually melts and fuses onto these could look lumpy and bumpy if applied to a rough surface. The last thing I do is bevel the bottom edge to smooth the stoneware here, as these will be the only regions of bare clay left visible on the finished piece. And then I stamp the pot with my maker's mark, my signature essentially. And notice where I pinch as I press, containing the wall from either side so the clay doesn't splay out as my porcelain stamp is pressed into the clay. I wanted to do a bit more smoothing and straightening of the stem itself from the outside, but obviously with it now being hollow, I can't really press down from on top easily to keep it all steady. So instead I place a bat down with a spinner on top and press down through that. And with the small teapot placed inside, that's it finished for now. And I actually really like it. I mean, it's sort of ridiculous, but I can certainly see myself enjoying a pot of tea displayed in something so grand. Now, the next step is something that I'm going to have to do very carefully, and that's dry this out slowly so that nothing warps or cracks. But I don't have to be as careful as I would have needed to be had I made this pot from 2 parts and stitched them together. In fact, if that was the case, I would have dried these out very slowly. But with this, as long as I don't rush the process, it should be absolutely fine. Now, I'm going to skip forward a tiny bit here, but in the interim this piece was packed into my electric kiln for a bisque firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. But we'll pick up with the plinth being unpacked, and after this first firing, the clay has partly vitrified, making the body both much stronger and also partly permeable, like a sponge. This means if I were to dunk it in water, it would draw in much of the moisture, and this is a vital quality when you're glazing pots. But before I move on to that, I first need to wax the foot. To do this, I simply tap center the piece, with my eye focused on the foot being dead on. I can then brush a thin layer of wax over the foot, creating a very simple wax resist, which means when this piece is dipped into the glaze won't adhere to this part, which is really important, as if I did glaze the foot and fired it on my shelf like I did with the rest of my pots, it would simply fuse to it, the glaze on the foot, turning to glass and welding the pot in place. Once the wax is dried, which only takes a moment, the plinth is grasped with a pair of tongs and then it's dipped into a pale green feldspathic glaze, with extra care taken to ensure that the glaze fills the stem portion properly. The red in the glaze here is coloured by 1% red iron oxide, but after being reduction fired, this will turn a pale green colour, despite how it looks now. The next step, a few days later, after the glaze is fully dried out, is to clean up the glazed vessel. This process involves wiping over the tongue marks and generally just cleaning up any stray drips or prominent marks on the surface. Ideally, I want a flush, even surface covering the entire pot, as generally speaking the neater it is now, the better it's going to look once fired. Much of this work is done with a sponge on a stick, my fingertip, or a metal scraper. When I do this task, I work over a basin of water which catches most of the glaze dust, which I can later recycle into the larger buckets this was initially dipped into. The key here is to make the surface flush, but without going too deep, as if too much glaze is removed it creates a thin spot, which, with this particular glaze, will likely fire brown, as it means the iron-rich clay beneath can show through more. And when this sadly happens, normally my fault, it ruins the uniformity of the glaze, resulting in a piece that I'll either try and reglaze and refire, or, if it's too bad, it'll simply be relegated as a second or third. And the last step is to wipe clean the foot, as despite the wax being there, the glaze never settles perfectly around it, which means it needs to be wiped around with a wet sponge to remove any droplets of glaze that have settled on it and to neaten up the line where glaze and clay meet. I'm especially meticulous about this part in particular, as I want the feet of my pots to look really neat. I want people to turn them over and notice the care and attention that's gone into them. And with that, this experimental plinth is ready to pack into my gas kiln for its reduction firing. I'll be placing it on the highest shelf, which I always love to pack as there are no props getting in the way for this layer. The glaze-clad pots are slotted in with about 2 or 3 millimeters left between each. They absolutely cannot touch, as if they do the glaze will melt and fuse the two pieces together, damaging both of them in the process, as afterwards they've got to be cracked apart. Early the following morning, normally at about 7 o'clock on the dot, the kiln is lit and the 9-hour firing can commence. Unlike my electric kiln, which can be programmed and fired automatically, this kiln is fired and controlled entirely by hand. It's not too complex a process. It can be intimidating to learn, but once you roughly understand the process, it's not too bad. At 860 degrees precisely, I initiate reduction, which I do by sliding the damper to be about half closed. This means the exhaust can't escape quickly enough, and in essence, inside the chamber, there simply isn't enough oxygen, but fuel needs oxygen to burn properly. So it ends up stripping it away from the clay and glazes themselves, and it's this which allows this type of firing to create particular colours and textures that you can't quite achieve in the same way with an electric kiln. And finally, at 1290 degrees, or once cone 10 has been reached, for you potters watching, the gas can be switched off, the firing now finished. And now all that's left to be done is to wait for the kiln to cool down enough for it to be unpacked, a process that normally takes about 2 days. And here it is, now covered in a pale green glaze and, well, considerably smaller. But it fired really well, I think. There are no distortions and the glaze is even and flush over the entire pot. It was a really good kiln load overall. The one thing I have to do before it's actually finished is sand the bottom, as during the firing the clay shrinks around the coarse particles of grog the body contains, meaning even though I burnished it really well at the leather hard stage, the body still becomes coarse again after it's fired. I've still got to be careful though, as if I sand away too much, the brown, tan colour the clay has can be ground away, leaving a flat, grey colour in its wake that certainly has less character. As always, these pots can be difficult to capture in video properly, so here are 4 simple photographs to better show it off. Fundamentally, what I've made is an object for displaying things, or a gigantic chalice or goblet, but the shape of the bowl at the top is a bit too wide to drink from, although I suppose it could be used as a raised dog bowl, although it's way too tall for the pup in this video. Either way, as an object, I think I'm going to enjoy taking photographs with it for a while, as a means of displaying pots in perhaps a more ornamental way, but I think the next iteration needs to be thrown about a third larger proportionally. Especially if I want to use it for larger teapots. For now though, I'm happy with this initial test. There is also one more change I'd like to make in the next iteration, and that's a slight widening of the foot, so that the stem section tapers more from bottom to top. I think it's a fraction too straight here, but otherwise there's nothing wrong with it. There are no cracks inside the stem, nor has the glaze crawled deep in the crevices of this part, which is something that I thought could happen. Anyhow, thank you so much as always for taking your time to watch, and to see me fuss so much over a single object. I hope you found this either interesting or useful, and, as always, I'll see you next time.